The security camera footage would later show only shadows and smoke, but those who were there would never forget the sound of her boots on the concrete floor, heavy, deliberate, each step echoing through the warehouse like a countdown. When the dust settled and the tactical team swept through the building, they found her combat boots sitting empty by the loading dock, laces still tied, soles worn smooth from years of service. Inside, 23 hostages sat blinking in the sudden flood of emergency lights, alive, unharmed, and asking the same question over and over. Where did she go? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the glass towers of downtown Seattle like a gray shroud, diffusing the early sunlight into pale ribbons that barely reached the streets below. On the 15th floor of the Meridian Financial Building, Detective Sarah Chin stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Crisis Command Center, watching the fog roll in from Puget Sound. Her reflection stared back at her, superimposed over the city skyline, a woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and prematurely silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore a simple black blazer over dark jeans, her service weapon holstered at her hip, and on her feet, a pair of well-worn combat boots that had seen more action than most people twice her age. Behind her, the command center hummed with the controlled chaos of modern law enforcement. Banks of monitors displayed real-time feeds from traffic cameras, satellite imagery, and building schematics. Analysts hunched over laptops, their screens alive with data streams and predictive algorithms. The air was thick with the electronic whir of cooling fans and the subdued chatter of radio communications. Everything was digital, everything was connected, everything was supposed to work seamlessly together to solve problems faster than ever before. At the center of it all sat Detective Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, 32 years old and already marked as a rising star in the department. Her workspace was a shrine to modern policing. 3 curved monitors arranged in a perfect arc, a tablet displaying real-time criminal databases, and a headset that kept her connected to every relevant agency from the FBI to Homeland Security. Amy's fingers danced across a haptic keyboard, pulling up facial recognition data, cross-referencing known associates, and running probability matrices that could predict criminal behavior with 78% accuracy. Her uniform was immaculate, her badges polished, and her confidence unshakable. She had graduated summa cum laude from Police Academy, held advanced degrees in criminal psychology and data analysis, and had never encountered a case that couldn't be solved with the right application of technology and procedure. Sarah turned away from the window as her radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent, the kind of practiced neutrality that meant something very bad was happening somewhere in the city. Multiple units were being requested at the Westport Industrial Complex, reports of gunfire, possible hostage situation. Sarah's hand moved instinctively to her radio, but Amy was already responding, her voice crisp and authoritative as she coordinated the initial response. Unit 7th Alpha, establish a perimeter at Industrial Way and Harbor Drive. Unit 12 Charlie, I need eyes on all building exits. Aviation Unit, get me thermal imaging of the entire complex. Amy's fingers never stopped moving as she spoke, pulling up building blueprints, employee records, and security protocols. Dispatch, patch me through to the tactical response team. I want full digital surveillance packages deployed within 15 minutes. Sarah watched Amy work with something that might have been admiration if it weren't tinged with concern. The younger detective was undeniably brilliant, a perfect product of the new generation of law enforcement that solved crimes with algorithms and arrested suspects with data points. But there was something in Amy's approach that reminded Sarah of a chess player who had memorized every opening move, but had never learned to improvise when the game went off script. The call details continued to stream in through the emergency services network. The Westport Industrial Complex was a sprawling maze of warehouses and manufacturing facilities on the south side of the city, most of it abandoned or converted to artist studios and startup incubators. At 8:30 that morning, witnesses reported hearing automatic gunfire from Building 7, a former textile factory that had been converted into office space for a tech company called Velocity Dynamics. Initial reports suggested that several armed individuals had entered the building during the morning shift change and were holding an unknown number of employees hostage. Amy stood up from her workstation, already reaching for her tactical vest. "Chen, you're with me. We'll establish mobile command on site and coordinate with the tactical team." She paused, looking at Sarah up and down with barely concealed disapproval. "You might want to change into something more appropriate. This is going to be a complex operation requiring strict protocol adherence." Sarah looked down at her civilian clothes and combat boots, then back at Amy's tactical gear. "I'll be fine. These boots have gotten me through worse." The drive to the industrial complex took 23 minutes through morning traffic, during which Amy maintained a constant stream of radio communications and data updates. Her cruiser was equipped with the latest mobile command technology, multiple screens displaying live feeds from drone surveillance, facial recognition matches from security cameras, and real-time behavioral analysis of the suspects. Sarah rode in the passenger seat, watching the city flow past while listening to Amy orchestrate what was rapidly becoming one of the largest law enforcement operations Seattle had seen in years. Facial recognition has identified at least 3 suspects: Marcus Webb, 28, multiple assault charges; David Park, 31, weapons violations; Jennifer Walsh, 26, suspected involvement in 3 previous hostage situations. All 3 are known associates of the Red Line Liberation Front, a domestic terrorist organization with anti-corporate motivations. Sarah frowned. How did facial recognition get positive IDs so fast? Building security cameras aren't usually that clear. New AI enhancement protocols. The system can extrapolate facial features from partial images and cross-reference with probability matrices. It's 94% accurate in controlled conditions. And in uncontrolled conditions? The system is designed to adapt to various scenarios. We trust the data. They arrived at the industrial complex to find it transformed into a small city of emergency vehicles. Fire trucks, ambulances, SWAT vehicles, and unmarked federal cars created a perimeter around Building 7, their red and blue lights painting the gray morning in urgent colors. A mobile command center the size of a small bus had been positioned 3 blocks away, its satellite dishes and antenna arrays reaching toward the cloudy sky like electronic prayers. Emmy immediately made her way to the command vehicle where FBI Special Agent Catherine Mills was coordinating federal involvement in the operation. Mills was a woman in her 40s with the kind of crisp professionalism that came from years of handling high-stakes situations. She wore a dark suit under a tactical vest and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen every possible variation of human crisis. "Detective Rodriguez," Mills said without looking up from her own array of monitors, "your reputation precedes you. I understand you've been developing some innovative approaches to hostage negotiation." "Thank you, Agent Mills. I've been working with our behavioral analysis unit to create predictive models for hostage situations. By analyzing communication patterns, stress indicators, and historical precedents, we can predict suspect behavior with remarkable accuracy." Amy gestured to her tablet, which was displaying a complex flowchart of decision trees and probability percentages. "The system has already identified the most likely outcomes for this scenario and suggested optimal intervention strategies." Mills nodded approvingly. "Excellent. We'll integrate your analysis with our own intelligence gathering. How long before your tactical assessment is complete?" "The preliminary model should be ready within 30 minutes. Full psychological profiles and tactical recommendations within the hour." Sarah stood at the edge of the mobile command center, listening to the exchange while watching the building through a pair of binoculars. Building 7 was a 5-story brick structure with large industrial windows, most of which had been covered with newspaper or cardboard by its current tenants. The main entrance faced the street, but Sarah could see at least 3 other possible entry points, including a loading dock on the north side and what appeared to be a fire escape on the east wall. The building was quiet now. No movement visible in the windows, no signs of the chaos that must be unfolding inside. Her radio buzzed with an incoming communication from one of the patrol units that had established the perimeter. "Command, this is Unit 15 Delta. We've got a witness here, says she was in the building when it happened. Maria Santos works as a receptionist for Velocity Dynamics."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Amy immediately turned her attention to the radio. "Patch her through to mobile command. We need detailed intelligence on building layout and suspect positions." A few minutes later, Maria Santos arrived at the command center, escorted by 2 patrol officers. She was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and hands that shook as she accepted a cup of coffee from one of the paramedics. Her eyes were wide with shock, but her voice was steady as she began to describe what had happened. "I was at my desk when they came in," she said. 3 of them, maybe 4. They had rifles, wore masks. They didn't say much at first, just herded everyone into the main conference room on the 3rd floor. I was in the bathroom when it started, heard the shouting and gunfire. I managed to get out through the service elevator before they secured the building. Amy leaned forward, her tablet ready to record every detail. "How many hostages do you estimate are inside?" "Maybe 25, 30 people. Most of the morning shift was already at work. The conference room where they're keeping everyone has only one entrance, but there's a service corridor that runs behind it. Used to be part of the old textile machinery setup." "What about the suspects? Did they make any demands? Say anything about their intentions?" Maria shook her head. "Not while I was there, but I heard one of them on a radio talking about the schedule and staying on target. They seemed organized, like they had done this before." Sarah stepped closer, pulling out a small notebook from her jacket pocket. "Maria, you said you've worked in that building for a while. 3 years, since Velocity Dynamics moved in. Do you know about any other ways in or out? Old maintenance tunnels, service passages, anything that might not show up in the building plans?" Maria's eyes brightened slightly. "There's a freight tunnel that connects to the loading dock, goes all the way to the basement of Building 5 next door. The textile company used it to move materials between buildings. Most people don't know it exists." Amy frowned, checking her tablet. "That's not showing up in any of the architectural databases." "It wouldn't," Sarah said quietly. "Those tunnels were probably sealed off or abandoned decades ago. The city records might not have been updated." Agent Mills looked up from her monitors. "We need visual confirmation of all possible entry points. I'm requesting additional drone surveillance and ground-penetrating radar to map any subsurface connections." As the morning progressed, the operation continued to expand. More federal agents arrived, along with specialists in hostage negotiation, tactical assault, and electronic surveillance. A secondary command post was established to monitor social media and communications intercepts. Psychologists were brought in to create detailed profiles of the suspects based on their known associations and previous activities. Every aspect of the crisis was being analyzed, categorized, and fed into computer models that promised to predict the optimal resolution strategy. Amy stood at the center of it all, orchestrating the flow of information like a conductor leading a very complex orchestra. Her screens displayed real-time updates from dozens of sources: traffic cameras tracking suspect vehicles, cell phone records showing communication patterns, financial databases revealing potential funding sources for the operation. The technology was impressive, even to Sarah, who had seen her share of investigations transformed by digital innovation. But as Sarah watched the data streams and algorithm outputs, she felt a familiar unease growing in her chest. She had been a detective for 15 years, had worked cases that ranged from simple domestic disputes to complex organized crime investigations. In all that time, she had learned to trust certain instincts that couldn't be quantified or programmed into a computer. Right now, those instincts were telling her that something was wrong with the picture they were building of this crisis. The first hint came from the communications intercepts. The suspects were using encrypted radio frequencies, but the NSA had developed new decryption algorithms that could break most commercially available encryption systems. The intercepted conversations showed careful coordination and detailed planning, but they also revealed something unexpected. The suspects were discussing exit strategies that didn't match any of the building plans or surveillance data. "They're talking about the river route," reported the communications specialist. "Multiple references to water access and boat schedules. But Building 7 is more than half a mile from the nearest navigable waterway." Amy pulled up a satellite map, zooming in on the industrial complex and surrounding area. "Could they be referring to the storm drain system? Some of those channels are large enough to move through." "Possible," Agent Mills said. "But our ground-penetrating radar hasn't detected any significant underground water flow in this area. Sarah stepped away from the command center and walked toward the building, her combat boots crunching softly on the gravel parking lot. She pulled out her phone and called an old contact, Jimmy Nakamura, who had worked construction in this part of the city for 30 years before retiring to become a private security consultant. "Jimmy, it's Sarah Chen. I need your memory about the Westport industrial area. You ever work on any of those old textile buildings?" Jimmy's voice was gravelly from years of smoking, but his recall was sharp. "Yeah, I did some renovation work there in the 90s. Why? What do you remember about underground access, tunnels, drainage, anything that might not show up in the building plans?" There was a pause as Jimmy thought. "Funny you should ask. That whole complex was built over an old creek bed. Before they developed the area, there was a natural waterway that ran from the hills down to the Sound. When they built the factories, they diverted the creek into underground channels. Some of those channels are still active, especially during heavy rain." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Would someone be able to move through those channels? If they knew where to look and didn't mind getting wet, sure. The main channel runs right under Building 7, connects to the municipal storm system about 6 blocks north. From there, you could get all the way to the waterfront. Sarah thanked Jimmy and ended the call, then stood looking at Building 7 with new eyes. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing more details of the surrounding area. To the north, she could see a slight depression in the ground that might mark the path of the old creek bed.
To the west, a series of storm drains disappeared under the adjacent parking lot. She walked back to the mobile command center, where Amy was deep in conversation with a tactical team leader about potential assault scenarios. The computer models had generated a detailed probability matrix showing the optimal timing and approach for a coordinated entry. According to the analysis, the best chance for a successful rescue would come in approximately 45 minutes, when suspect alertness levels were predicted to reach their lowest point. "Amy," Sarah said quietly, "I think we need to consider the possibility that our intelligence is incomplete." Amy looked up from her tablet, irritation flickering across her face. "What do you mean? We have comprehensive surveillance data, complete building schematics, and detailed psychological profiles of all known suspects." "That's just it. The suspects we've identified might not be the only ones involved, and the building schematics might not show everything we need to know." Agent Mills turned toward them, her expression sharp with interest. "Do you have specific intelligence about additional suspects or building features?" Sarah explained what she had learned about the underground creek system and the possible water routes the suspects had been discussing. As she spoke, she watched Amy's confidence begin to show the first small cracks. The younger detective's fingers moved quickly across her tablet, trying to cross-reference the new information with existing databases. "There's no record of any active waterways in this area," Amy said. "The city engineering department shows all natural drainage as having been permanently diverted in 1987. "City records aren't always complete," Sarah replied, "especially when it comes to infrastructure that was modified decades ago." Mills looked between the two detectives, weighing their conflicting assessments. "We need verification. I'm ordering additional ground surveillance to check for any underground access points we might have missed." As the tactical teams began expanding their search pattern, Sarah continued to study the building and its surroundings. Something about the whole situation felt carefully orchestrated, not just by the suspects inside, but by someone who understood how modern law enforcement would respond to this type of crisis. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that they were being led to a specific conclusion, guided by information that had been carefully planted to reinforce their assumptions. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "The creek still flows. Check the old map room in City Hall. Basement level, section M7. You have 1 hour." Sarah stared at the message, her mind racing. Someone was trying to help, but who? And why reach out to her specifically instead of going through official channels? She looked around the command center, noting the dozens of federal agents and local officers, all of them focused on their screens and radios and data streams. Everyone was so busy processing information that no one was really looking at what was happening right in front of them.
She made a decision that would later be called everything from brilliant to reckless. Without telling Amy or Agent Mills where she was going, Sarah walked to her car and drove toward downtown Seattle. The trip to City Hall took 18 minutes, during which her radio chattered constantly with updates from the crisis scene. The tactical teams had found evidence of recent activity in some of the storm drains, but nothing that confirmed the existence of underground passages large enough for human movement. City Hall was a massive concrete structure built in the 1960s, all sharp angles and small windows that made it look more like a fortress than a seat of government. Sarah had been there countless times over the years, usually to testify in court cases or meet with prosecutors. She knew her way around the building, but she had never been to the basement map room. The security guard at the main entrance recognized her and waved her through without requiring identification. Sarah took the elevator to the basement level and found herself in a maze of narrow corridors lined with filing cabinets and storage rooms. Section M7 turned out to be a cramped space filled with rolled maps and architectural drawings dating back to the city's founding. Just as Jimmy had described, a creek wound through the area, running roughly north to south before emptying into Elliott Bay. Someone had traced the creek's path in red ink and added notations about the underground channels that had been built to contain it. According to the map, the main channel passed directly under Building 7, with access points at several locations that correspond roughly to storm drains in the current street system. But more importantly, the map showed that the channel was much larger than she had imagined, easily wide enough for a person to move through, with several natural chambers where the underground flow had carved out larger spaces in the bedrock. Sarah photographed the map with her phone and was about to leave when she noticed something else. Clipped to the back of the original map was a more recent drawing, this one printed on computer paper and dated just 3 weeks ago. It showed the same underground system, but with additional notations marking entry and exit points, flow rates, and what appeared to be structural modifications to some of the access tunnels. Someone had been planning this operation for weeks, if not months. They had studied the underground system, mapped out routes that wouldn't appear in any official database, and calculated exactly how law enforcement would respond to a hostage crisis in that specific building. But why leave this information where she could find it, and how did they know she would think to look? Her phone buzzed again with another text message. "They're not in the building. Check the eastern access tunnel. You're running out of time." This time, Sarah tried calling the number, but it went directly to voicemail. She left City Hall and drove back toward the industrial complex, her mind working through the implications of what she had discovered. If the suspects weren't actually in Building 7, then all of the surveillance and tactical planning was focused on the wrong target. But that would mean the real hostages were somewhere else entirely, possibly underground, possibly already being moved toward an escape route that law enforcement didn't even know about. When she arrived back at the command center, the operation had reached a new level of intensity. Additional federal agencies had arrived, along with specialized equipment for what was now being classified as a potential domestic terrorism incident. Amy stood at the center of a group of tactical commanders, pointing to a three-dimensional model of Building 7 that showed optimal assault routes and breach points. The psychological profile indicates that the suspects are becoming increasingly agitated. Our models predict that they'll begin harming hostages within the next 30 minutes unless we initiate contact. I recommend immediate tactical intervention. Mills nodded grimly. We've confirmed that all exit routes are secured. Thermal imaging shows multiple heat signatures on the 3rd floor consistent with the witness description of hostage locations. We're prepared to execute a coordinated assault. Sarah approached the group, pulling out her phone to show them the photographs of the underground maps. I think we need to reconsider our assumptions about this situation. Amy looked at the phone screen with barely concealed impatience. Chen, we don't have time for archaeological research. We have confirmed visual and thermal evidence of the suspect and hostage locations. But what if that evidence is wrong? What if we're seeing what they want us to see? Mills stepped closer, studying the map images with more interest. Where did you get these? Sarah explained about the text messages and her trip to City Hall, watching as both Amy and Mills processed the implications. Amy's expression moved from impatience to concern to something approaching alarm. "You're suggesting that this entire operation is a diversion," Mills said slowly. "I'm suggesting that we verify our intelligence before we act on it. If there's even a possibility that the real hostages are somewhere else, shouldn't we check?" Amy pulled up the thermal imaging data on her tablet, studying it with fresh eyes.
The heat signatures are consistent with human presence, but they could be generated by other sources. Portable heaters, electronic equipment, even pre-recorded video loops designed to fool our sensors. Mills was already reaching for her radio. "All units, hold position. We need additional reconnaissance before proceeding with tactical entry." For the next 15 minutes, the operation transformed again as resources were redirected toward investigating the underground access routes. Specialized cameras were lowered into storm drains. Ground-penetrating radar was focused on detecting movement in subsurface areas, and teams of officers began checking every access point within a 6-block radius of Building 7. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the patrol units conducting perimeter security reported finding fresh tire tracks near a storm drain entrance 4 blocks north of the main building. The tracks showed evidence of recent heavy vehicle activity, with multiple vehicles entering and leaving the area within the past few hours. "Command, this is Unit 22. We've got something here. The storm drain cover has been modified with some kind of locking mechanism, definitely not city equipment." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she listened to the radio traffic. Everything was starting to come together, but not in the way anyone had expected. The text messages, the underground maps, the carefully orchestrated timing of the crisis, it all pointed to something much more complex than a simple hostage situation. Agent Mills was coordinating the investigation of the underground access points when Sarah's phone buzzed one more time. This message was longer than the others. "Building 7 is empty. Real hostages in underground chamber, eastern tunnel system, approximately 200 meters from main storm access. Armed guards posted at tunnel entrance. Water level rising. Time running out." Sarah showed the message to Mills, who immediately dispatched teams to investigate the eastern tunnel system. But as the operation expanded to include underground search and rescue, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. The careful coordination and digital precision that had defined the first few hours of the crisis was giving way to something more chaotic and uncertain. They were no longer following a predetermined protocol. They were improvising in real time, making decisions based on incomplete information and gut instincts. Amy stood at her workstation, staring at screens that no longer seemed to provide clear answers. The predictive models had become useless once the basic assumptions proved false. The facial recognition data was meaningless if the suspects weren't where the cameras could see them. All of the technology that had seemed so powerful just hours before was now just expensive equipment displaying irrelevant information. "Chen," Amy said quietly, her voice stripped of its earlier confidence, "how did you know to look for that underground system?" Sarah considered the question as she watched teams of officers disappearing into storm drains with waterproof equipment and underwater cameras. "I didn't know. I just had a feeling that something wasn't right about the picture we were building. Sometimes the data tells you what you want to hear instead of what you need to know." The first confirmation came 23 minutes later. A search team working in the eastern tunnel system reported finding evidence of recent human activity: food wrappers, portable lighting equipment, and what appeared to be a makeshift holding area in one of the larger underground chambers. But the chamber was empty, and there were signs that whoever had been there had been moved recently. "Command, this is Search Team Alpha. We've found the secondary location, but it's been abandoned. Estimate that occupants were moved within the last hour, following wet footprints and equipment traces toward the main waterway access." Mills turned to Sarah with an expression of grudging respect.
How did you know? Sarah looked toward Building 7, where tactical teams were still maintaining their positions around a target that was probably empty. I've been doing this long enough to know that the obvious answer is usually wrong. When everything fits together too perfectly, when all the data points in the same direction, that's when you need to start looking for what's missing. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Search Team Beta, operating in a different section of the tunnel system. Command, we've got active contact. Multiple individuals in the main drainage channel, approximately a half-kilometer north of the primary search area, requesting immediate backup and extraction equipment. Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized they were finally closing in on the real situation. But she also knew that the most dangerous part of any rescue operation was often the final approach, when suspects realized they were trapped and had to make desperate decisions. Amy was coordinating the convergence of multiple teams on the tunnel location, her earlier technological confidence replaced by a more traditional approach to tactical communication. She used her radio and her voice, directing units based on real-time reports from teams in the field rather than algorithmic predictions. All units, we have visual confirmation of hostage presence in the main drainage tunnel. Approach from the north and south access points. Maintain communication silence until breach is initiated. Sarah listened to the operational chatter while studying the underground maps that she had photographed at City Hall. Something about the timing still bothered her. The text messages had arrived at precisely the right moments to guide her toward crucial discoveries, but always with just enough urgency to prevent careful consideration of who was providing the information or why. Her phone remained silent now, but she had the unsettling feeling that whoever had been guiding her investigation was still watching, still orchestrating events towards some predetermined conclusion. The question was whether that conclusion involved the safe rescue of the hostages or something else entirely. The operation was about to enter its most critical phase, but Sarah realized that despite all of the intelligence gathering and tactical planning, they still didn't know who they were really dealing with or what the ultimate objective of this crisis actually was. They had found the hostages, but the mystery had only deepened. The first gunshot echoed through the storm drain system at exactly 11:47 a.m., its sharp crack amplified and distorted by the concrete walls until it sounded like thunder rolling through an underground canyon. Every officer in the mobile command center froze for a heartbeat, their radios suddenly alive with urgent voices reporting contact. Agent Mills was the first to respond, her training kicking in as she coordinated multiple teams converging on the drainage tunnel from different access points. The underground map that Sarah had discovered was now displayed on every available screen, marked with colored dots representing the positions of search teams, suspected hostage locations, and potential escape routes. What had begun as a straightforward hostage crisis had evolved into something much more complex, a three-dimensional chess game being played in the dark spaces beneath the city. Sarah grabbed a tactical vest from the equipment rack and started toward the nearest storm drain entrance, but Amy caught her arm. The younger detective's face was pale but determined, her earlier technological confidence replaced by a more traditional approach to tactical communication. She used her radio and her voice, directing units based on real-time reports from teams in the field rather than algorithmic predictions. All units, we have visual confirmation of hostage presence in the main drainage tunnel. Approach from the north and south access points. Maintain communication silence until breach is initiated. Sarah listened to the operational chatter while studying the underground maps that she had photographed at City Hall. Something about the timing still bothered her. The text messages had arrived at precisely the right moments to guide her toward crucial discoveries, but always with just enough urgency to prevent careful consideration of who was providing the information or why. Her phone remained silent now, but she had the unsettling feeling that whoever had been guiding her investigation was still watching, still orchestrating events towards some predetermined conclusion. The question was whether that conclusion involved the safe rescue of the hostages or something else entirely. The operation was about to enter its most critical phase, but Sarah realized that despite all of the intelligence gathering and tactical planning, they still didn't know who they were really dealing with or what the ultimate objective of this crisis actually was. They had found the hostages, but the mystery had only deepened. The first gunshot echoed through the storm drain system at exactly 11:47 a.m., its sharp crack amplified and distorted by the concrete walls until it sounded like thunder rolling through an underground canyon. Every officer in the mobile command center froze for a heartbeat, their radios suddenly alive with urgent voices reporting contact. Agent Mills was the first to respond, her training kicking in as she coordinated multiple teams converging on the drainage tunnel from different access points. The underground map that Sarah had discovered was now displayed on every available screen, marked with colored dots representing the positions of search teams, suspected hostage locations, and potential escape routes. What had begun as a straightforward hostage crisis had evolved into something much more complex, a three-dimensional chess game being played in the dark spaces beneath.
Behind them, two SWAT officers provided backup, their tactical equipment and automatic weapons creating a reassuring presence in the confined space. But Sarah knew that if they encountered serious resistance in the tunnels, there would be little room for maneuvering and limited options for tactical response. The underground system was a maze of interconnected passages and chambers, most of which weren't shown on any official map. Their radios crackled with updates from other teams working different sections of the tunnel network. Search Team Alpha had found evidence of recent activity in a chamber approximately half a kilometer to the north, including makeshift bedding and food containers that suggested people had been held there for several hours. Search Team Beta was investigating a section of the system that connected to an abandoned subway tunnel, following footprints and equipment traces that seemed to lead toward the waterfront. Sarah paused at a junction where three tunnels converged, studying the LED markers that had been placed to guide their movement. Someone had put considerable thought into creating a navigation system for the underground passages, installing lights and signs that would allow people to move quickly and efficiently through the darkness. But the question remained, who had done this, and were they trying to help the hostages escape or lead law enforcement into a trap? Amy knelt beside a small electronic device that had been attached to the tunnel wall near the junction. It was a motion sensor, the kind used in high-end security systems, but it had been modified to operate on battery power and transmit data wirelessly. "Someone's been tracking movement through these tunnels," she said quietly. "This is sophisticated surveillance equipment, not something you'd find at a hardware store." Sarah examined the device more closely, noting the professional quality of the installation and the fact that it was positioned to monitor all three tunnel entrances. "How many of these do you think there are down here?" "Based on the coverage pattern, probably dozens, maybe more." Amy pulled out her tablet and tried to detect any wireless signals that might be coming from the surveillance network, but the concrete walls and metal infrastructure created too much interference for reliable scanning. "Whoever set this up has been planning for a long time and has access to significant resources." They continued deeper into the tunnel system, following the LED path as it wound through a series of chambers and passages that clearly predated the modern city above them. Some sections showed evidence of the original creek bed, with natural rock formations and mineral deposits that spoke of decades of flowing water. Other areas had been modified with concrete and steel, creating artificial channels and access points that allowed maintenance workers to service the drainage system. The sound of voices reached them before they saw any light, distant conversation that echoed strangely through the curved passages. Sarah held up a hand to signal the team to stop, then crept forward to a point where the tunnel curved sharply to the left. She could see artificial lighting ahead,
much brighter than the LED strips they had been following, and the shadows of people moving around in what appeared to be a large chamber. Sarah pulled out her phone and activated the camera, using the zoom function to get a better view of the activity ahead. Through the curved opening, she could see at least 6 people sitting on the floor of the chamber, their hands bound but otherwise appearing unharmed. 2 armed guards stood near what looked like the entrance to another tunnel, their positions suggesting they were watching for approaching threats rather than monitoring the hostages. Amy crept up beside her and peered around the curve, studying the scene with the analytical approach that had served her well in traditional investigations. "I count 8 hostages, 2 guards that we can see, but there could be more in other parts of the chamber. The hostages look calm, not panicked or injured, and the guards aren't treating them roughly. That's consistent with a politically motivated kidnapping rather than a violent crime. They want the hostages alive and unharmed." Sarah's radio buzzed softly with an incoming transmission from the mobile command center. Agent Mills was coordinating the final approach from multiple teams, with units moving through different sections of the tunnel system to surround the chamber where the hostages were being held. The plan was to overwhelm the kidnappers with superior numbers and firepower, minimizing the risk to the civilian captives. But as Sarah listened to the tactical coordination, she felt the same unease that had been growing throughout the day. The situation was proceeding exactly as if it had been scripted, with law enforcement discovering each clue and following each lead in a predetermined sequence. Even finding the hostages felt too easy, too convenient. Her phone buzzed with another text message, the first she had received since entering the tunnel system. "Not what it seems. Check the water level. Look for the real target." Sarah showed the message to Amy, who frowned as she read it. "Your mysterious contact again. But what do they mean about the water level?" Sarah looked down at the drainage channel that ran along the bottom of the tunnel. When they had first entered the system, the water was flowing at a steady but manageable level, maybe 6 inches deep in the center channel. But now the water seemed higher, and she could hear an increase in the flow rate that suggested heavy runoff from somewhere upstream. "It's been raining in the mountains," Amy said, checking a weather app on her phone. "The drainage system automatically channels runoff from the entire watershed. If there's significant precipitation upstream, these tunnels can flood very quickly." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. What if that's the real plan? What if the hostage situation is designed to get law enforcement personnel into the tunnel system just before a flood? Amy's eyes widened as she processed the implications. But why? What would be the point of trapping police officers underground? Before Sarah could answer, the water level in the drainage channel jumped noticeably, and they could hear the distant roar of increased flow somewhere deeper in the system. The LED lights that had been guiding their movement began to flicker as water reached electrical connections that weren't designed for submersion. Sarah grabbed her radio and called the mobile command center. "Command, this is Detective Chen. We need immediate evacuation of all personnel in the tunnel system. The water level is rising rapidly." Mill's voice came back immediately, sharp with concern. "Chen, what's your status? Are you in immediate danger?" "Unknown, but we need to get everyone out of here now. This could be a trap designed to flood the tunnels with personnel inside." Even as she spoke, Sarah could see the water level in the drainage channel continuing to rise. What had been a shallow stream was now becoming a significant flow, and the concrete walls were channeling the water with increasing velocity. The hostages in the chamber ahead were still sitting calmly, seemingly unaware of the developing situation. Amy was studying her tablet, trying to access city engineering data about the drainage system's capacity and flood protocols. According to the municipal database, these tunnels can handle normal storm runoff, but if there's a significant release from the upstream reservoirs, the flow rate could increase by a factor of 10 within minutes. Can the reservoirs be controlled remotely? They're automated systems, but they can be overridden by anyone with access to the water management network. Sarah felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The sophisticated surveillance equipment, the modified tunnel access points, the carefully orchestrated timing of the crisis. It all pointed to someone who had intimate knowledge of both law enforcement procedures and municipal infrastructure systems. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a complex operation designed to exploit multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. The radio crackled with urgent transmissions from other teams in the tunnel system, as Search Team Alpha was requesting immediate extraction from their position, while Search Team Beta had lost contact entirely in a section of the system that was known to flood during heavy rain. Sarah made a decision that would later be debated in after-action reports and internal investigations. She decided not to retreat toward the tunnel entrance they had used to enter the system, but moved forward toward the chamber where the hostages were being held. "Chen, what are you doing?" Amy called after her. "If this is a trap, then the hostages are bait, but there's still people who need to be rescued."
Amy hesitated for a moment, then followed, her sense of duty overriding her instincts for self-preservation. Behind them, the two SWAT officers maintained their positions, providing security as the water continued to rise in the drainage channel. The chamber ahead was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a natural cavern that had been expanded and reinforced with concrete to create a junction point from multiple tunnel systems. The hostages sat in a group near the center of the chamber, their hands bound with plastic zip ties, but otherwise appearing unharmed. The two guards they had observed earlier were positioned near tunnel entrances on opposite sides of the chamber, their weapons ready, but not actively threatening the captives. As Sarah approached the edge of the chamber, one of the guards noticed her movement and called out a warning to his partner. Both men turned toward the tunnel entrance, where Sarah and Amy were positioned, but they didn't immediately raise their weapons or show signs of panic. "Police officers," Sarah called out, her voice echoing strangely in the large space. "We're here to help. The tunnels are flooding. Everyone needs to evacuate immediately." One of the guards, a man in his 30s wearing military-style clothing and equipment, stepped forward. "Detective Chen, I presume. We've been waiting for you." Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline as she realized that her arrival had been anticipated. "Who are you? What do you want?" "My name is Marcus Webb, and I'm trying to save these people's lives, the same as you." Amy moved up beside Sarah, her weapon drawn but not aimed directly at the guards. Webb was identified as one of the suspects in the original incident at Building 7. Webb nodded. "That's correct, but the situation is more complicated than your intelligence reports suggested. The water in the drainage channels around the chamber was now flowing fast enough to create a continuous roar that made conversation difficult. Several of the hostages had noticed the rising water and were beginning to show signs of concern, but they remained seated and relatively calm." Sarah studied Webb's face, trying to read his intentions. "If you're trying to save these people, then help us get them out of here." "That's exactly what I intend to do. But first, you need to understand what's really happening here." Webb gestured toward one of the other guards, who produced a waterproof tablet and activated a presentation that projected onto the chamber wall. The image showed a schematic of the entire tunnel system with water flow indicators and timing projections that painted a terrifying picture. 3 hours ago, someone initiated an emergency release from the Cascade Reservoir, approximately 50 miles upstream from this location. The water is currently flowing through the natural creek system that feeds into these tunnels. Based on the flow rate and channel capacity, this entire section of the underground system will be completely flooded within the next 20 minutes. Amy stared at the projection, her analytical mind working through the implications. But why? What's the purpose of flooding the tunnels? "To eliminate evidence," Webb said grimly, "and to create a disaster that can be blamed on the terrorist group we're supposed to represent." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, both literally from the vibration of the increasing water flow and figuratively as she realized the scope of what they were dealing with. "You're saying you're not actually terrorists?" "We're private security contractors who were hired to stage a fake terrorist incident for a training exercise. But somewhere along the way, the exercise became real." Webb's partner moved to one of the hostages and began cutting the zip ties that bound her hands.
The woman was in her 40s, well-dressed despite her ordeal, and she immediately stood and began helping to free the other captives. "Dr. Elizabeth Manning," the woman said, introducing herself to Sarah and Amy. "I'm the senior researcher at Velocity Dynamics. We weren't randomly selected for this incident. Our company has been developing water management software for municipal systems. Someone wanted us silenced." The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with terrifying clarity. The fake terrorist incident had been designed to eliminate the research team that had developed software capable of controlling municipal water systems. The flooding of the tunnels would destroy any evidence of the real conspiracy while creating a convenient cover story about a terrorist attack gone wrong. Amy was already on her radio, trying to contact the mobile command center to warn them about the true nature of the threat. But the increasing water flow was interfering with radio transmission, and she was having difficulty getting through to Agent Mills. "We need to move now," Webb said urgently. "The main evacuation route leads through the northern tunnel system, but it requires crossing 2 sections that will be underwater within minutes." Sarah looked around the chamber, counting the hostages and assessing their physical condition. Most appeared to be in good health, but several were older individuals who might have difficulty moving quickly through the challenging underground terrain. "How many evacuation routes are there?" "2 that might still be passable. The northern route is shorter, but it requires crossing flooded sections. The eastern route is longer, but stays above the flood level." Dr. Manning stepped forward, her voice urgent but controlled. "Detective, there's something else you need to know. The water release isn't random. It's being controlled by someone with access to our company's software. They can increase or decrease the flow rate at will." Sarah felt a chill as she realized that they were not just racing against a natural flood, but against an adversary who could manipulate the water levels to prevent their escape. "Can the system be shut down?" "Only from a secure terminal with the proper access codes. But those terminals are located in our main office building, which is currently surrounded by federal agents who think we're terrorists." Amy finished her attempts to contact the command center and reported that all communication with the surface had been lost. The water was now flowing fast enough to interfere with radio signals, and the underground environment was blocking their emergency transponders. Webb gathered his equipment and began leading the group toward one of the tunnel entrances. "We have maybe 15 minutes before the water reaches dangerous levels in this chamber. After that, anyone still underground will be trapped." The evacuation began with Webb and his partner taking point, their knowledge of the tunnel system crucial for navigating the maze of passages and chambers. Sarah and Amy stayed with the group of hostages, helping the older and less mobile individuals while keeping watch for any signs of pursuit or additional threats. The LED lighting system was beginning to fail as electrical connections became submerged, leaving them dependent on flashlights and the illumination from their tactical equipment. Dr. Manning stayed close to Sarah as they navigated the treacherous terrain. "Detective, if we survive this, you need to know that our research identified vulnerabilities in water management systems throughout the Pacific Northwest. Someone is using our work to target critical infrastructure." "Who hired your company to develop the software?" "A consortium of municipal governments and federal agencies."
But the funding came through several shell companies that we were never able to trace back to their original sources. Sarah processed this information as they reached a junction where the tunnel split into 3 different directions. Webb studied a hand-drawn map that showed the current water levels and flow patterns, then pointed toward the easternmost passage. "This route should stay above the flood level, but it's longer and more difficult. We'll need to climb through some sections that weren't designed for foot traffic." The group began moving through a series of chambers and passages that were clearly part of the original creek system, with natural rock formations and irregular surfaces that made walking treacherous. The older hostages were struggling with the physical demands of the evacuation, and progress was slower than Webb had anticipated. Amy checked her watch and calculated their remaining time based on the water level projections. "At this rate, we'll be cutting it very close. Is there any way to slow down the flooding?" Webb shook his head. "Not from down here. The system is being controlled remotely, and whoever is running it has access to real-time data about our location and movements." Sarah realized that their mysterious contact had gone silent
at exactly the moment when they needed help the most. The text messages that had guided her investigation had stopped coming, leaving them on their own in the underground maze. The tunnel ahead narrowed considerably, forcing the group to move in single file through a passage that was barely wide enough for one person. The sound of water was getting louder, suggesting that they were approaching another junction with the main drainage system. Webb moved carefully through the narrow space, testing each step before committing his full weight to surfaces that might not be stable. Behind them, the water continued to rise, and they could hear the distant sound of debris being swept along by the increasing flow. Sarah knew that if they were caught by the flood in the narrow passage, there would be no escape. The confined space would become a death trap for everyone in the group. Dr. Manning stumbled on a loose rock and nearly fell, but Amy caught her arm and helped her regain her balance. "How much farther?" Manning asked, her voice showing the strain of the evacuation. "According to the map, we should reach the eastern access point in about 10 minutes, Webb replied, "but that assumes the route is still passable." They emerged from the narrow passage into another large chamber, this one showing clear signs of recent modification. Someone had installed permanent lighting and ventilation systems, along with what appeared to be communication equipment and emergency supplies. It was clearly a staging area that had been prepared well in advance of the current crisis. Amy examined the communication equipment, noting that it included both radio transceivers and computer terminals with satellite uplinks. "This is a full command center. Someone has been operating out of here for weeks or months." Sarah studied the layout of the chamber and the positioning of the equipment. Everything was designed for rapid deployment and quick evacuation, suggesting that whoever had been using this space never intended to stay for extended periods. Webb checked his watch and urged the group to keep moving. "We're running out of time. The main flood surge should reach this level within the next few minutes." They left the command chamber through another tunnel that angled upward toward what Webb indicated was the final access point to the surface. The tunnel was steeper than the previous sections, requiring the group to climb over rock formations and concrete barriers that had been installed to control water flow during normal operations. Sarah could hear the roar of water getting closer behind them, and she knew that the flood was following their route through the tunnel system. If they didn't reach the surface soon, they would be caught in a confined space with nowhere to run. The final section of the tunnel was a steep climb through what had once been a maintenance shaft for the original drainage system. Metal rungs had been embedded in the concrete walls, creating a ladder that led upward toward a circle of daylight that seemed impossibly far above them. Webb went first, testing each rung before trusting it with his full weight. Several of the hostages were visibly exhausted from the evacuation, and Sarah knew that not everyone would have the strength to complete the climb. But as the sound of rushing water grew louder behind them, she also knew that they had no choice but to try. The first of the floodwater reached the bottom of the shaft just as the last person in their group began climbing toward the surface. Sarah could see the water rising rapidly up the walls of the shaft, chasing them with relentless persistence as they fought to reach safety above. Sarah's hands burned against the metal rungs as she hauled herself up the maintenance shaft, the circle of daylight above growing larger with each desperate pull. Below her, the sound of rushing water had become a continuous roar that seemed to shake the concrete walls. Dr. Manning was struggling on the ladder beneath her, her grip weakening with exhaustion as the floodwater rose steadily up the shaft walls. The shaft was narrower than it had appeared from below, barely wide enough for one person to climb comfortably. Sarah could feel the walls pressing against her shoulders as she reached for each successive rung, her tactical vest catching on rough concrete edges that scraped and tore at the fabric. Behind her, Amy was helping to support one of the older hostages, a man in his 60s who was having difficulty maintaining his grip on the wet metal. Webb's voice echoed down the shaft from somewhere above, urgent but controlled. "Keep moving. Water's at the 15-foot mark and rising fast." Sarah looked down and could see the dark surface of the flood reflecting the lights from their equipment,
a mirror of destruction that was climbing relentlessly toward them. The water was moving faster than she had expected, carrying debris from the tunnel system that created eddies and currents in the confined space of the shaft. Dr. Manning's hand slipped on a rung that was slick with condensation, and for a moment she hung by one arm before Sarah grabbed her wrist and helped her regain her hold. "I can't do this," Manning gasped, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Yes, you can," Sarah said firmly. "Just one rung at a time. Don't look down." The climb continued with agonizing slowness as each member of the group struggled up the ladder toward the surface. Sarah could hear Amy below her, encouraging the other hostages and helping those who were having difficulty. The water was now close enough that she could feel spray from its turbulent surface, cold droplets that stung her face and made the metal rungs even more treacherous. Webb reached the top of the shaft first and immediately began working to remove the heavy metal cover that sealed the access point. Sarah could hear him grunting with effort as he fought to lift the barrier that hadn't been opened in years. The sound of metal scraping against concrete echoed down the shaft, mixed with his increasingly frantic efforts to break through to the surface. "It's sealed," Webb called down. "The cover has been welded shut from the outside." Sarah felt her heart sink as she processed the implications. Someone had deliberately trapped them in the tunnel system, sealing off the escape routes to ensure that no one could survive to tell the truth about what had happened. The fake terrorist incident had been designed not just to eliminate the research team, but to silence anyone who might have discovered the real conspiracy. The text messages that had guided her investigation had stopped coming, leaving them on their own in the underground maze. Amy's voice came from below, strained but determined. "Chen, my tablet is picking up a weak signal. There might be another access point nearby." Sarah looked up at Webb, who was still struggling with the sealed cover. "How far to the next exit?" "Maybe 50 meters along the surface level, but I don't know if we can get there before the water reaches the top of the shaft." The flood was now less than 10 feet below them and rising steadily. Sarah could see pieces of debris swirling in the current, including sections of the LED lighting system that had been torn loose by the force of the water. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a continuous roar that made communication difficult. Dr. Manning was beginning to show signs of panic, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow as she looked down at the approaching water. "We're going to drown down here," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise.
Sarah positioned herself directly above Manning, using her body to block the woman's view of the rising flood. "Look at me," she said firmly. "We're not going to die here, but I need you to keep climbing." Webb abandoned his efforts to open the sealed cover and began examining the walls of the shaft for any other possible exit points. The original construction had included several access panels for maintenance workers, but most appeared to have been sealed or blocked over the years as the tunnel system was modified. Amy was now helping two of the older hostages who were struggling with the physical demands of the climb. Both were breathing heavily and showing signs of exhaustion that suggested they might not be able to continue much longer. The water was close enough now that Sarah could feel the humidity from its surface, warm and oppressive in the confined space. "There," Webb called out, pointing to a section of the shaft wall where the concrete showed signs of more recent construction. "That panel leads to a lateral drainage tunnel. It might connect to another access point." Sarah studied the panel, noting that it was secured with bolts rather than welds. "Can you get it open?" Webb pulled a multi-tool from his tactical vest and began working on the bolts that held the panel in place. The metal was corroded from years of moisture, and several of the bolts were frozen in place by rust and mineral deposits. He worked frantically as the water continued to rise, now less than 8 feet below the lowest members of their group. The first bolt came free with a sharp crack that echoed through the shaft. Webb moved to the second bolt, his hands working with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with similar challenges before. Behind him, Sarah could see that one of the hostages was beginning to lose his grip on the ladder rungs. Amy called up from below, her voice tight with strain. "We've got a problem down here. Mr. Patterson is cramping up. I don't think he can climb much higher." Sarah looked down and could see the man Amy was referring to, an older individual who was gripping the ladder with white knuckles while his legs shook with exhaustion. The water was now close enough that its spray was reaching the lower members of the group, making the already treacherous climb even more dangerous. Webb got the second bolt loose and moved to the third, but his multi-tool slipped on the corroded metal and nearly fell into the rising water below. He caught it at the last second and resumed his efforts, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the shaft. "How much time do we have?" Dr. Manning asked, her voice barely controlled. Sarah checked the water level and made a quick calculation based on its rate of rise. "Maybe 3 minutes before it reaches the bottom of the group." The third bolt finally came free, followed quickly by the fourth. Webb grabbed the edge of the panel and pulled, but it remained firmly in place. Years of corrosion had essentially welded the metal to its frame, creating a barrier that might be impossible to remove with the tools they had available. Amy was now helping Mr. Patterson with one arm while maintaining her own position on the ladder. The older man was barely conscious, his strength completely depleted by the combination of stress and physical exertion. Below them, the water was beginning to reach the bottom rungs of the ladder. Sarah made a decision that would later be called either heroic or reckless, depending on who was telling the story. She unholstered her service weapon and aimed it at the corroded bolts that were still holding the panel in place. "Everyone cover your ears," she called out, then fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The sound of gunfire in the confined space was deafening, but the bullets found their mark. The remaining bolts shattered under the impact and the panel swung open to reveal a horizontal tunnel that led away from the shaft into darkness. Webb immediately crawled through the opening and disappeared into the lateral tunnel. His voice echoed back to them a moment later, muffled but audible. "It's clear. About 20 meters to another access point." Sarah helped Dr. Manning through the opening, then turned to assist Amy with Mr. Patterson. The older man was barely conscious, his strength completely depleted by the combination of stress and physical exertion. Below them, the water was now reaching the bottom rungs of the ladder. Sarah crawled as fast as she could through the narrow space, her combat boots scraping against the concrete as she pushed herself forward. Behind her, she could hear Amy helping Mr. Patterson, encouraging him to keep moving, even though he was barely conscious. The tunnel began to angle upward slightly, and Sarah could see a dim glow ahead that suggested they were approaching the surface access point. But she could also hear water beginning to flow into the tunnel behind them, a sound that meant they only had minutes before their escape route would be completely flooded. Webb reached the exit first and began working to clear away debris that had accumulated over the opening. He could see his silhouette against the daylight as he pulled away chunks of concrete and metal that had fallen from the surface construction above. "Almost there," he called back, "but the opening is smaller than I thought. We'll have to go through one at a time." Dr. Manning reached the exit second and squeezed through the narrow opening with Webb's help. She could hear voices on the surface as other people realized what was happening and began to assist with the rescue operation. The sound of sirens suggested that emergency responders were beginning to arrive at the scene. Amy pushed Mr. Patterson ahead of her through the tunnel, his weight making the confined space even more difficult to navigate. Sarah stayed behind them, acting as rear guard while the water continued to flow into the tunnel from the flooded shaft. The sound of the flood was getting louder, suggesting that the main surge was finally reaching their level. Mr. Patterson reached the exit but was too weak to pull himself through the opening. Webb and Dr. Manning grabbed his arms and hauled him up to the surface where paramedics were waiting to provide medical assistance. Amy followed immediately after, her tactical gear scraping against the sides of the narrow opening as she squeezed through. Sarah was the last to reach the exit, and by that time the water in the tunnel was flowing fast enough that it created a current that pulled at her legs. She could feel the flood trying to drag her back into the darkness as she fought to reach the opening where Amy and Webb were waiting to help her. The surface access point opened into a small park that bordered the industrial complex, where a crowd of emergency responders and curious civilians had gathered to watch the rescue operation. Sarah emerged from the underground system covered in mud and debris, her tactical vest torn and her combat boots caked with sediment from the tunnel system. Agent Mills was waiting at the scene, along with several FBI vehicles and a mobile command center that had been relocated from the original crisis site. Her expression was a mixture of relief and confusion as she watched the survivors of the underground evacuation being treated by paramedics. "Detective Chen," Mills said as Sarah approached.
"We need to talk. The situation at Building 7 was completely different from what we initially believed." Sarah nodded, still catching her breath from the evacuation.
The whole thing was a setup. The terrorist incident, the hostage situation, even the flooding. Someone orchestrated all of it to eliminate the research team and anyone who might have discovered the truth. Dr. Manning was being examined by a paramedic, but she was alert enough to provide crucial information about the conspiracy. "Agent Mills, the software we developed has been weaponized. Someone is using it to target water management systems throughout the region. This was just the beginning." Mills pulled out her phone and began making calls to coordinate a broader investigation. "We need to secure the Velocity Dynamics offices and examine all of their research data. If someone has access to municipal water systems, they could cause catastrophic damage." Amy sat on a bench near the park entrance, her tablet open as she tried to piece together the digital evidence they had gathered during the crisis. Despite the chaos of the underground evacuation, she had managed to download data from the command center they had discovered in the tunnel system. "I've got communication logs, equipment specifications, and what looks like a complete organizational chart," she reported. "This operation involved at least a dozen people and significant financial resources." Sarah walked over to where her boots had left muddy prints on the concrete pathway. The combat boots that had carried her through 15 years of police work were now stained with sediment from the underground creek system, marked by the day's events in a way that would never completely wash clean. Webb was speaking with federal agents, providing detailed information about his role in the staged operation and the identity of the people who had hired his security company. His cooperation was crucial for understanding the scope of the conspiracy and identifying all of the participants. As the immediate crisis wound down, Sarah realized that they had prevented a tragedy but uncovered something much larger. The fake terrorist incident had been just one component of a broader attack on critical infrastructure, designed to test vulnerabilities and eliminate potential threats to the conspiracy. Her phone buzzed with one final text message from the mysterious contact who had guided her investigation. "Well done. Check your email for the rest of the story." Sarah opened her email and found a message containing dozens of documents that detailed a coordinated effort to compromise water management systems across the Pacific Northwest. The conspiracy involved government officials, private contractors, and foreign interests working together to create vulnerabilities that could be exploited for economic or political purposes. The rescue operation was over, but Sarah knew that the real investigation was just beginning. Somewhere in the evidence they had gathered were the keys to unraveling a conspiracy that threatened the security of millions of people. And despite the danger they had faced underground, she was ready to see it through to the end. The empty combat boots that would later be found by the loading dock were still hours away, but the legend they would represent had already begun with a detective who trusted her instincts over her technology and chose to act when others hesitated. The email contained a digital trail that stretched across 3 time zones and involved at least 17 government contractors, 4 municipal water departments, and 2 foreign intelligence services. Sarah sat in the FBI field office at 2 in the morning, her eyes burning from staring at computer screens, while Amy worked beside her to decode the massive data dump that had arrived from their anonymous source. Agent Mills paced behind them, drinking her 4th cup of coffee while coordinating with federal agencies across the country. The documents revealed that the Seattle incident was part of a coordinated test of water infrastructure vulnerabilities, with similar operations planned for Portland, Sacramento, and Phoenix over the next 6 months. "The sophistication level is unprecedented," Mills said, studying a flowchart that showed the organizational structure of the conspiracy. "Whoever planned this has access to classified infrastructure data and years of operational planning experience." Amy highlighted a section of code that appeared in multiple documents. "This software signature matches the Velocity Dynamics research, but it's been modified with additional capabilities. Someone took their water management system and turned it into a weapon." Dr. Manning sat at another workstation, her ordeal in the tunnels behind her as she focused on identifying which of her company's projects had been compromised. The research team had been developing predictive algorithms for municipal water systems, software designed to optimize distribution and prevent contamination events. "We never imagined it could be used to cause the problems it was designed to prevent," Manning explained. The same algorithms that predict optimal water flow can be reversed to create maximum damage with minimum warning. Sarah studied surveillance footage from the tunnel system that had been recovered from the hidden command center. The cameras had captured weeks of activity, showing a sophisticated operation that involved dozens of people working in shifts to prepare the underground staging area. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a timestamp from 3 weeks earlier. "They've been planning this since before Velocity Dynamics even knew they were a target." The footage showed individuals in professional clothing installing equipment and testing communication systems. But more importantly, it showed them practicing the exact scenario that had played out during the crisis, with mock hostages and simulated rescue operations. Mills leaned over Sarah's shoulder to study the screen. "They rehearsed our response. They knew exactly how we would react to a hostage situation, right down to which tactical teams would be deployed." Amy pulled up personnel files for the FBI agents and local police officers who had responded to the initial crisis. Someone with access to law enforcement databases provided detailed information about our capabilities and standard operating procedures. The implications were staggering. The conspiracy hadn't just targeted the research team, it had infiltrated the very agencies responsible for protecting them. Sarah felt a chill as she realized that their anonymous contact might have been the only reason any of them had survived the day. Her phone buzzed with a new message, this one containing coordinates and a time. "Loading dock, Building 7, 1 hour. Come alone." Sarah showed the message to Mills, who immediately began coordinating surveillance teams to monitor the meeting location. But Sarah knew that if their contact had managed to stay hidden throughout the investigation, federal surveillance wouldn't be enough to identify them. "I'm going," Sarah said, standing up from her workstation. "Not alone," Mills replied firmly. "We'll have teams positioned throughout the area. If you do that, we'll never learn who's been helping us. This person has risked everything to expose the conspiracy." Amy looked up from her computer screen. "Chen, this could be a trap. We don't know who we're dealing with." Sarah considered the warning, but her instincts told her that their mysterious contact had been genuine throughout the crisis. "Someone guided us to the truth when everyone else was following false leads. I think we owe them the benefit of the doubt." The drive to the industrial complex took 15 minutes through empty streets. Sarah parked several blocks away and walked toward Building 7, her boots echoing off the pavement in the pre-dawn silence. The building looked different now, its windows dark and its entrances sealed with police tape. The loading dock was located on the north side of the building, a concrete platform that had once been used to move freight between trucks in the interior warehouse space. Sarah approached carefully, her hand resting on her service weapon while her eyes scanned for any signs of movement or hidden observers. A figure emerged from the shadows near the loading bay doors, moving with the careful precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment. Sarah recognized the silhouette before she could make out the features, and her breath caught in her throat as she realized who had been guiding their investigation. "Hello, Sarah," said Captain Jennifer Walsh, formerly of the Seattle Police Department's Intelligence Division. Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications. Walsh had been reported as one of the terrorist suspects in the initial intelligence briefing, but she had actually been working undercover to expose the conspiracy from within. "You've been dead for 6 months," she said quietly. "Officially, yes. It was the only way to get close enough to the operation to understand its scope." Walsh stepped into the dim light from a nearby street lamp, revealing a woman in her early 40s with premature gray hair and the weathered face that spoke of years spent in dangerous situations. "The text messages, the information about the underground system,
That was all you." Walsh nodded. "I've been tracking this conspiracy for 2 years, ever since I noticed unusual patterns in infrastructure security assessments. Someone was systematically mapping vulnerabilities in water systems across the region." Sarah studied Walsh's face, noting the exhaustion and stress that suggested months of living under deep cover. "Why didn't you contact the FBI directly? Why involve me?" "Because the conspiracy includes people in federal agencies. I couldn't risk going through official channels." Walsh pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a list of names that included several high-ranking officials in Homeland Security and the EPA. The Velocity Dynamics research was just the latest target,
They've been eliminating anyone who might threaten their operation, using staged terrorist incidents to cover their tracks. Sarah felt pieces of a massive puzzle clicking into place. The flooding of the tunnels was designed to eliminate evidence and witnesses, and to test their ability to manipulate water systems in real time. Today was a dress rehearsal for something much larger. Walsh activated her tablet and showed Sarah a map of the western United States with dozens of marked locations. These are all potential targets for coordinated infrastructure attacks. If they succeed, they could disrupt water supplies for millions of people. The scope of the threat was beyond anything Sarah had imagined. "What do you need from me?" "Help me finish this. I've gathered evidence, but I need someone with active law enforcement credentials to present it to the right people." Sarah looked around the empty loading dock, noting the isolation and vulnerability of their meeting location. "Why here? Why now?" Walsh pointed toward the building behind them. "Because this is where it all started. The original Velocity Dynamics offices were in this building before they moved to the new location. Someone wanted to send a message by targeting them here." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the pre-dawn silence. Multiple cars were converging on their location from different directions, their headlights creating moving patterns of light and shadow across the industrial landscape. "Federal agents," Sarah said, recognizing the formation pattern. Walsh's expression tightened. "They found us faster than I expected. I didn't tell them about the meeting." "I know, but they've been tracking my communications for weeks." The first FBI vehicle arrived at the loading dock, followed quickly by 3 others. Agent Mills emerged from the lead car with a team of armed agents, their weapons drawn as they approached the 2 women. "Captain Walsh," Mills called out, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, terrorism, and violation of federal security protocols." Walsh raised her hand slowly, but she didn't move away from Sarah. "Agent Mills, you need to listen to what I have to say. Your agency has been compromised." "Save it for your interrogation." Sarah stepped between Walsh and the advancing agents. "Wait, she's been working undercover to expose the real conspiracy." Mills signaled her team to maintain their positions while she approached. "Detective Chen, step away from the suspect. Captain Walsh is wanted in connection with multiple terrorist incidents." "She's been framed. The evidence on her tablet proves that the real terrorists are still out there." Walsh activated her tablet one final time and transmitted a data burst to Sarah's phone. "Everything you need is in those files. Don't let them bury the truth." The federal agents moved quickly to secure Walsh, but not before she managed to remove something from her tactical vest and place it on the concrete platform. Sarah looked down and saw a single combat boot, its leather scuffed and worn from years of service. "My partner," Walsh said as the agents led her away. "She didn't make it out of the last operation. Don't let her sacrifice be meaningless." Sarah picked up the boot and felt the weight, understanding that it represented more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of dedication and sacrifice, of people who chose to act when others hesitated. Mills approached Sarah as the other agents loaded Walsh into one of the vehicles. "Detective Chen, I need that tablet and any other evidence she provided." Sarah looked at the boot in her hands, then at her phone where Walsh's final data transmission was still downloading. "Agent Mills, what if she's telling the truth? What if the real terrorists are still planning their next attack?" "That's what the investigation will determine, but right now we need to secure all potential evidence." Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her career. She handed Mills the tablet that Walsh had been carrying, but she kept her phone and the combat boot. "I'll cooperate fully with the investigation, but I think we need to verify Walsh's claims before we dismiss them." As the federal vehicles drove away with their prisoner, Sarah stood alone on the loading dock in the growing light of dawn. The boot in her hands felt like a promise, a commitment to see the investigation through, regardless of the political consequences. Her phone contained evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, but she also knew that presenting that evidence would put her own career and safety at risk. The morning sun was beginning to illuminate the industrial complex, casting long shadows across the concrete platform where she had learned the truth about the crisis. Sarah placed the boot carefully in her car and drove back to the FBI field office, where Amy was still working through the night to analyze the data they had recovered. The investigation was far from over, but they now had a roadmap for exposing the real conspiracy. The legend of the empty combat boots would begin here, in this moment when one detective chose to trust her instincts over institutional pressure. And somewhere in the evidence they had gathered was the key to preventing an attack that could affect millions of lives. The hostages were safe, but the real battle was just beginning. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the abandoned warehouse district where it had all begun, watching demolition crews prepare to tear down Building 7. The morning fog rolled in from the sound just as it had on the day of the crisis, but this time she wore civilian clothes and carried no badge. Her resignation from the Seattle Police Department had been accepted 3 weeks ago, along with a letter of recommendation that praised her dedication while carefully avoiding mention of her final investigation. Amy Rodriguez had been promoted to detective captain, her technological expertise finally balanced with the hard-won wisdom of understanding when data could mislead as easily as it could illuminate. She stood beside Sarah now, her official vehicle parked at the construction perimeter while workers prepared to erase the last physical evidence of the conspiracy. The Phoenix operation was stopped 2 days ago. Homeland Security arrested 14 suspects, including 3 federal contractors who were using the same infrastructure vulnerabilities Walsh identified. Sarah nodded, watching a crane position itself to begin the demolition.
Any word on the Sacramento investigation? Still ongoing, but the water management software has been secured and the back doors have been closed. Amy paused, studying Sarah's profile. Your testimony was crucial in convincing the review board that Walsh was telling the truth. The federal investigation had taken months to unravel, with evidence pointing to a network of foreign intelligence operatives working with domestic contractors to map and exploit critical infrastructure weaknesses. Captain Jennifer Walsh had been quietly released from federal custody and given a new identity in exchange for her cooperation, but her official status remained classified. Dr. Manning had testified before Congress about the weaponization of municipal software systems, leading to new security protocols and oversight requirements for infrastructure technology. The Velocity Dynamics research team had been relocated to a secure federal facility where their work continued under strict supervision. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the combat boot that Walsh had left on the loading dock. She had kept it as a reminder of the price paid by those who chose to stand against corruption, even when it meant sacrificing their careers and identities. She saved a lot of lives, Amy said, recognizing the significance of the worn leather boot. She saved more than that. She saved the idea that someone has to be willing to act when the system fails. The demolition began with a controlled explosion that sent Building 7 collapsing into itself, tons of brick and concrete folding inward in a cloud of dust that obscured the industrial landscape. Sarah watched the building disappear, knowing that with it went the last physical evidence of a crisis that had changed everything about how she understood her role as a protector. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. New assignment if you're interested. Private sector, investigating infrastructure security. Same mission, different employer. Sarah showed the message to Amy, who smiled with something that might have been relief. You're not ready to retire, are you? Someone has to keep watching. Someone has to be ready to act when the technology fails and the protocols don't apply. They walked back toward their vehicles as the dust cloud from the demolition began to settle. The industrial complex would be redeveloped into mixed-use housing and retail space, erasing the history of what happened there, while the people responsible for preventing future incidents continued their work in secret. Amy stopped at her patrol car and turned back toward Sarah. For what it's worth, I learned more in 1 day working with you than I did in 2 years of technology training.
And I learned that data can be valuable if you remember it's just a tool, not an answer. Sarah got into her civilian car and drove downtown Seattle, where a new investigation was waiting. The private security firm that had sent the text message was staffed by former law enforcement officers and intelligence operatives who specialized in cases that fell between the jurisdictions of traditional agencies. The office was located in a nondescript building near Pike Place Market, with no signage to identify its purpose. Sarah took the elevator to the 7th floor and found herself in a reception area that looked more like a tech startup than a security company. A woman in her 50s greeted her from behind a reception desk, her professional demeanor suggesting years of experience with sensitive cases. "Detective Chen? Mr. Patterson is waiting for you in conference room A." Sarah recognized the name from the tunnel evacuation. The older man who had nearly drowned in the underground system had recovered fully and now served as the company's senior analyst. His near-death experience had given him a unique perspective on the importance of infrastructure security. Patterson stood up as Sarah entered the conference room, his handshake firm despite the tremor that remained from his ordeal in the tunnels. "Miss Chen, thank you for considering our offer. We have a situation in Portland that requires someone with your particular expertise." He activated a wall display that showed a map of the Pacific Northwest with several locations marked in red. Similar patterns to what we saw in Seattle? Infrastructure vulnerabilities being probed, key personnel being targeted, government contractors with questionable backgrounds. Sarah studied the display, noting the sophistication of the intelligence gathering and the familiar patterns of misdirection and false flag operations. How long has this been developing? At least 6 months, but the activity has accelerated in the past few weeks, suggesting that another operation is imminent. Patterson handed her a file containing preliminary reports and surveillance data. "We're authorized to investigate and prevent the operation, but we need someone who understands how these conspiracies develop and how to recognize when obvious solutions are actually traps." Sarah opened the file and found photographs of individuals who looked familiar from the Seattle investigation. Some of the same players were involved, suggesting that arresting the local operatives hadn't dismantled the larger network. "What kind of authority do I have?" "Broad discretion to investigate and coordinate with law enforcement agencies. No bureaucratic constraints, no political considerations. Just find the truth and stop the threat." Sarah looked out the conference room window toward Elliott Bay, where container ships moved slowly through the morning haze. The water looked calm and peaceful, but she knew that under the surface were currents and depths that could hide dangers until it was too late to escape them. "When do I start?" Patterson smiled with genuine relief. "Your flight to Portland leaves in 3 hours. Your partner is already en route." Sarah felt a familiar surge of anticipation as she realized that the work that she had been meant to do was just beginning. The badge and uniform were symbols of authority, but the real power came from the willingness to act when others hesitated, to see patterns when others saw only data, and to trust instincts when technology failed. Sarah got into her civilian car and drove toward downtown Seattle, where a new investigation was waiting. The private security firm that had sent the text message was staffed by former law enforcement officers and intelligence operatives who specialized in cases that fell between the jurisdictions of traditional agencies. The office was located in a nondescript building near Pike Place Market, with no signage to identify its purpose. Sarah took the elevator to the 7th floor and found herself in a reception area that looked more like a tech startup than a security company. A woman in her 50s greeted her from behind a reception desk, her professional demeanor suggesting years of experience with sensitive cases. "Detective Chen? Mr. Patterson is waiting for you in conference room A." Sarah recognized the name from the tunnel evacuation. The older man who had nearly drowned in the underground system had recovered fully and now served as the company's senior analyst. His near-death experience had given him a unique perspective on the importance of infrastructure security. Patterson stood up as Sarah entered the conference room, his handshake firm despite the tremor that remained from his ordeal in the tunnels. "Miss Chen, thank you for considering our offer. We have a situation in Portland that requires someone with your particular expertise." He activated a wall display that showed a map of the Pacific Northwest with several locations marked in red. Similar patterns to what we saw in Seattle? Infrastructure vulnerabilities being probed, key personnel being targeted, government contractors with questionable backgrounds. Sarah studied the display, noting the sophistication of the intelligence gathering and the familiar patterns of misdirection and false flag operations. How long has this been developing? At least 6 months, but the activity has accelerated in the past few weeks, suggesting that another operation is imminent. Patterson handed her a file containing preliminary reports and surveillance data. We're authorized to investigate and prevent the operation, but we need someone who understands how these conspiracies develop and how to recognize when obvious solutions are actually traps. Sarah opened the file and found photographs of individuals who looked familiar from the Seattle investigation. Some of the same players were involved, suggesting that arresting the local operatives hadn't dismantled the larger network. What kind of authority do I have? Broad discretion to investigate and coordinate with law enforcement agencies. No bureaucratic constraints, no political considerations. Just find the truth and stop the threat. Sarah looked out the conference room window toward Elliott Bay, where container ships moved slowly through the morning haze. The water looked calm and peaceful, but she knew that under the surface were currents and depths that could hide dangers until it was too late to escape them. When do I start? Patterson smiled with genuine relief. Your flight to Portland leaves in 3 hours. Your partner is already en route. Sarah felt a familiar surge of anticipation as she realized that the work that she had been meant to do was just beginning. The badge and uniform were symbols of authority, but the real power came from the willingness to act when others hesitated, to see patterns when others saw only data, and to trust instincts when technology failed. Sarah got into her civilian car and drove toward downtown Seattle, where a new investigation was waiting. The private security firm that had sent the text message was staffed by former law enforcement officers and intelligence operatives who specialized in cases that fell between the jurisdictions of traditional agencies. The office was located in a nondescript building near Pike Place Market, with no signage to identify its purpose. Sarah took the elevator to the 7th floor and found herself in a reception area that looked more like a tech startup than a security company. A woman in her 50s greeted her from behind a reception desk, her professional demeanor suggesting years of experience with sensitive cases. "Detective Chen? Mr. Patterson is waiting for you in conference room A." Sarah recognized the name from the tunnel evacuation. The older man who had nearly drowned in the underground system had recovered fully and now served as the company's senior analyst. His near-death experience had given him a unique perspective on the importance of infrastructure security.